The Eurovision Song Contest is the biggest non-sporting event on the planet. Every year, somewhere between 160 and 200 million people watch the final of the show. There are countries desperate to get in this thing. Kosovo and Kazakhstan have been trying for years. Hell, there was even rumors about China participating at one point. So if the contest is so in demand, why have 12 countries chosen to walk away? Well, it's complicated, and while some did it voluntarily, some were practically kicked out of the door. Today, we are going to go through each of the sore losers, bankrupt broadcasters, and active perpetrators of war crimes that have left the contest. We're going to talk about what made them leave and their chances of returning in the future. Before we start, I'm not including any countries that don't exist anymore, so apologies to fans of Serbia and Montenegro and Yugoslavia. Quickly, before we get on to the first country, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy it. You can find me and my editor Jay's socials in the description as well. We have a Patreon where you can support us financially, as well as getting videos a day early, and you can join the Discord too as well. We're active in there all the time. Now that's out of the way, let's get right to it. We're going to start this video with one of the most controversial withdrawals and one of the most famous of recent years, and that is Russia. They last participated in the contest in 2021, and they were originally planning to participate in 2022. That plan got rather derailed when Vladimir Putin decided it would be a good idea to try and have his spring holidays in Kiev. That obviously is why they withdrew, or rather were kicked out from the contest. In the show's entire history, this is the only time where a country has been removed from the contest because of the risk of bringing it into disrepute. I know some of you are going to bring up Belarus here. We're going to come back to them later because it's slightly different. Following this, the Russian broadcasters that are members of the European Broadcasting Union were suspended from the organization. That makes it impossible for the country to return for the time being. The broadcasters actually claimed that they were withdrawing from the EBU altogether, but because they never filed the relevant paperwork, they are still listed as suspended rather than removed. That means while for now it is impossible for them to return to the contest, it doesn't necessarily rule it out in the future should the political realities change. The obvious part of this is that there's no way that Russia can participate in the contest as long as the invasion of Ukraine is ongoing. The second part is that those broadcasters must once again comply with the standards of the European Broadcasting Union. That's going to be pretty difficult given that the reason they were suspended was because of excessive government interference. And that means that in theory, even without the war, they wouldn't fulfill the requirements to once again participate. That's before we get onto the fact that on a personal level, and I'm sure many people agree with this, I wouldn't feel comfortable with a Russian participation in Eurovision for quite a long time. Now we've got that obvious elephant in the room out of the way, let's talk about the other 11. Firstly, we have the microstate of Monaco, which participated in the contest up until the 1970s and then again a few times in the 2000s. They're unique not only on this list but in Eurovision history as being the only country to have never sent an entry that is actually from the country they're representing. I guess it's not hugely surprising given that Monaco is essentially a strip of casinos and F1 drivers, but it still feels a little bit like it's undermining the whole point of the show. Given the volume of Cyprus-registered yachts owned by Russian billionaires that go through Monaco every year, though, this might be the only way that any kind of Russian representation gets back into the contest, or at the very least, the closest thing to it. In all seriousness, there is actually a very real chance that Monaco will return to the contest in the next few years. Before I talk about that, I want to reflect a little bit on why they withdrew in the mid-2000s. There were a couple of parts to that withdrawal, and the most obvious was just that the results were not very good. During their stretch, in that time, they didn't make it to a single final. They also had some complaints with how the contest was run. The former head of delegation complained to the EBU alongside what he calls other small countries. In this, he mentions Andorra, which is fair enough, but also Belgium, which feels a little harsh. Anyway, the point is he complained to the EBU alongside those countries about the voting patterns in the contest, about neighborhood and political voting. There is some merit to this concern, but there is less to his other main complaint with the show. That is that, in his words, fans were voting more for the show rather than for the songs. To be honest, I think by the time we get to the mid to late 2000s, that just reflects an attitude that is pretty badly outdated and also demonstrates one of the reasons why they failed to qualify. Eurovision has been about more than just the songs for a very long time, and that was true well before the mid 2000s. The final concern was a little more corporate. The Monegasque broadcaster that was participating in the contest at the time, ended up under the umbrella of the French television organisation TF1. They are a direct competitor to the French broadcaster that participates in the contest. Naturally, they were pretty uninterested in promoting a show that was broadcast on a rival network. Fast forward to now though, and there actually is a real chance of return because a lot of these obstacles have been removed. The main one was that corporate block, and that is now solved thanks to a new broadcaster that has been set up in the country. This broadcaster is called TV Monaco, and in recent years they have allocated funding dedicated to exploring a return to the contest. They've been in active communication with Eurovision fan media, clarifying that the reason they didn't attempt to participate in 2024 was that they simply weren't ready yet because it's so much work in addition to the already strenuous process of setting up a TV channel. Crucially, the editor-in-chief said that at this stage, it was not a project that they could focus on immediately. This suggests that the door is open to potentially exploring it in future, and they wouldn't put any funding into it if they weren't interested. 2025 still looks a little unlikely, but I am really optimistic about Monaco returning to the contest in the future. And if they choose to do so, Charles Leclerc might be interested in singing for them. Hilariously, if he did that, he would, as I said, become the first Monegasque singer to ever sing for Monaco at Eurovision. From Monaco, we're moving to Morocco, and that one might trigger a bit of a confused response for those of you that aren't super familiar with the history of the contest. Morocco have participated in Eurovision exactly once, in 1980, and it sounded like this. Unfortunately, they came second last, and all 7 of their points came from Italy. It probably won't surprise you to know that their participation in that year and their subsequent lack of interest are both down to Israel. This is also the reason why Tunisia tried and then decided not to participate in 1977, and Lebanon did the same thing in 2005. All of these countries refused to participate in most international events alongside Israel and have done for a long time. For Morocco, that has potentially changed in the last few years, but I'll come on to that in a minute. What was different about 1980 is that Israel wasn't participating that year, even though they had won in 1979. Israel was already hosting the contest in that year because they'd also won the show in 1978, and the public broadcaster refused to host a second time in a row. This was because it would cost way too much. Because of that, they gave away the rights to hosting, and the date that was eventually chosen coincided with the Israeli Remembrance Day. This meant that Israel withdrew, and Morocco was able to enter without facing any kind of repercussions from other members of the Arab League. Israel returned to the contest in 1981 and has been present ever since. As a result, Morocco has not come back. This is where things get a little bit interesting though, because something changed in 2020 that could have made a difference. In that year, a normalization agreement was signed between Morocco and Israel, which led to the exchange of embassies and the recognition of each other. At least in principle, this would remove a major barrier to Morocco participating in the contest. This is because displaying an Israeli entry would no longer be an implicit recognition of a state that the government doesn't recognize. After this agreement was signed, some in Israeli media did call for Morocco to return to the contest as well. Unfortunately, it's still not going to happen, and there are several reasons why. The contest, firstly, has just changed a lot since 1980, and Morocco is a deeply conservative country. Because of that, Morocco probably would not engage well with the values that the contest stands for. Secondly, while that legal and political barrier with regards to Israel has now gone, it would still be completely unacceptable to the Moroccan public to participate in the competition while they are also there. That has been especially true in the last 12 months. For these reasons, Morocco's participation is off the table for the foreseeable future. We already talked about one microstate in this video, which was Monaco. Now we're going to talk about another, and that is Andorra. Andorra participated a handful of times in the contest in the 2000s. Much like Morocco, they had very little success in this time period. As a result, they are the only country in the history of the contest never to have qualified for the final. They did have one close call in 2007 with a pretty standard rock song for the time that sounded like this.
Left, right, up and down, turn upside down. It's how we treat the war, and now can hide the fact that it's happening.
They also get some bonus points here for me because they sung regularly in Catalan, which brought a new language to the contest. As for their lack of participation, it's pretty straightforward. Eurovision is expensive, and it keeps getting more expensive too, especially when you're essentially a bunch of villages in the mountains. That gets pretty difficult to justify, especially when your televoting numbers were so low on some occasions that you didn't produce a valid result. That cost is what led to the broadcaster in Andorra pulling the plug in 2009, and we haven't seen them back since. There was a brief moment of hope in 2020 when their final participant from 2009, Susanna Georgi, claimed to have secured funding for them to return to the contest. Unfortunately, that never materialized, and there's been no news since. For that reason, I wouldn't expect to see them back in the contest anytime soon. Belarus is next, and while most of their exclusion from international competitions now is linked to Russia, in the case of Eurovision, that actually isn't true. Belarus dropped out a year before, and the origins of this actually link back to protests in the country in 2020. These followed an election which international observers documented was rigged. While the government did successfully suppress these protesters, for whatever reason, the country's broadcaster decided that Eurovision was a great way to try and rub the victory in. They submitted this song, and while on first listen you won't think it's propaganda, I'll talk about the lyrics in a minute and you will change your mind. So do not be fooled by its telemarketing background music energy. This might sound innocuous to a non-Russian speaking listener, but when you read the English lyrics, things get a little more sinister. They were blatantly about the protests, and with lines like "I'll teach you to dance to the tune" and "Obviously we tried too hard in vain, without the past everything will be simpler, you just heed my words," it's no surprise that everyone immediately caught on to this. This resulted in a massive backlash and one of the most negative receptions for any Eurovision entry ever. A number of fan media outlets even announced that they would refuse to cover the Belarusian entry at the contest that year. Shortly after, the EBU took action by rejecting the entry and asking the Belarusian broadcaster to submit another. After that follow-up entry was rejected as well, Belarus was withdrawn from the competition because they had missed the deadline to submit a valid entry. This wasn't what ruled them out long term though. There was no reason at that stage why they wouldn't have been able to return to the contest the following year. That changed at the end of May 2021. The Belarusian state broadcaster at that time aired the forced confession of the activist Roman Protasevich, where he confessed to causing mass unrest. That turned out to be the straw that broke the camel's back, because while the EBU had been worried about state encroachment on the broadcaster's independence for some time, at that point there was no way to hide it anymore. They were suspended from the European Broadcasting Union for 3 years, and while that 3 years has now completed, that suspension has been made indefinite. Because of that, we hit much the same reason as Russia in terms of a return to the contest. It's extremely unlikely. That would require the broadcaster to have a level of independence that just isn't possible in the current climate. For that reason, this isn't happening anytime soon. Slovakia is next, and that gives me yet another opportunity to remind you that Hungary was robbed. You can hear more about that and 9 other songs that were robbed in my video from a few weeks ago. For whatever reason, Slovakia and Eurovision have just never been a good match. They tried the contest twice, firstly in the 90s and again in the late 2000s and early 2010s. It just didn't work for them. Their highest finish ever was 19th, and on their second run, they didn't qualify for the final even once. As for the withdrawals, both essentially boiled down to the fact that there wasn't enough money in the broadcaster, and that was that. There was a recent brief period of hope, though, in 2023, when the broadcaster said they were considering a return in 2024. That hope was immediately dashed when Slovakia elected this guy, and the less you know about him, the better. In short, he's busy trying to reorganize the public broadcaster. He's also not a fan of Ukraine, gay people, Muslims, or being faithful to his wife. With the broadcaster essentially facing a hostile takeover from right-wing nutjobs, that means no Eurovision and no return for Slovakia anytime soon. It's a shame that they've never really had a chance to get going in the contest, but to be honest, I think it's pretty far down the list of priorities in Slovakia right now. One right-wing nutjob isn't enough for a video, so let's talk about another one, and that's Hungary. The weird thing with Hungary is their national selection, Adal, is still going. Their national broadcaster broadcaster MTVA, which, as we all know, stands for Media Szolgáltatás Támogató és Vagyonkezelő Alap, chose just before the pandemic to instead use the show to promote music nationally rather than as a platform to go to Eurovision. Unfortunately, though, I just don't think that story holds up. While the broadcaster might claim that the withdrawal was for that innocuous reason, if you dig under the surface, it's actually much more sinister. It's no coincidence that this came alongside a massive ramping up of anti-LGBT rhetoric from the Hungarian government. The hilarious thing here is that in 2020, one of that ruling party in Hungary's members of European Parliament was caught by police fleeing a gay orgy. Sadly for Hungary and its participation in Eurovision, there is no hope of a reversal of this decision anytime soon. Even though the government is facing the first serious challenge for a considerable period of time, there's no indication that their potential replacement would alter their stance towards the contest. I'd love to be surprised, but this one is a very long shot. Quickly before we move on, I do have to ask a question to the right-wing nutjobs watching this video, if any. Why is it that all of your political parties keep getting caught at gay orgies? Like, seriously, it's happened way too many times to be a coincidence. In any case, we're going to move on to Bosnia and Herzegovina. This one, to be honest, is kind of a sad story. They participated in the contest throughout the 90s and 2000s. Unfortunately, money was once again the issue, and they stopped participating after 2012. Since then, all we've seen was a single participation in 2016. The thing that makes this sad is the broadcaster wants to participate. Unfortunately, it's been lurching from crisis to crisis financially, and as a result, simply cannot afford to at the moment. As the years have passed, these financial problems have gotten worse and worse, to the point where that broadcaster now owes the European Broadcasting Union 8 million euros. Because of that debt, they're under sanctions that prevent them from, among other things, participating in Eurovision and its attached events. This year, things hit a new low after a court ordered the broadcaster to sell off its real estate assets in order to pay off the debt. None of this is helped either by the fact that the country has an extremely convoluted system funding its broadcasters. The public broadcasters are funded through a tax that is theoretically split between the different organizations. In practice, though, this unfortunately just means they all fight like rats in a sack, and ultimately refuse to pay each other sums of money which they are owed. The most egregious offender here is RTRS, which is the publicly funded broadcaster catering to the Serbian majority parts of the country. All of this mess is essentially rotting the broadcaster from the inside out, and every year the situation gets worse. The debts increase, there are sweeping cancellations of the programs they fund, and the conditions for the staff get worse and worse too. This is honestly a really depressing story of corruption and internal conflict in the country being played out through the medium of a public broadcaster. It is destroying the country's core institutions, not just this one, and it needs to stop. In theory, BHRT and Bosnia and Herzegovina can return to the contest, but it would require an extraordinary turnaround. Even if they're able to pay off their debt to the EBU, that still leaves an extraordinarily high barrier to participation, which is the 6 or 7-figure sum of euros needed each year to fund it. If your yearly budget is essentially 10p and a curly whirly, you are not going to be able to afford to go to Eurovision, especially in countries as expensive as Sweden or Switzerland. I would love for Bosnia and Herzegovina to return to the contest, and the intent is absolutely there. Sadly, unless a solution is found to stop BHRT from dying the extremely slow and painful death that it's currently dying, I can't see it happening anytime soon. Next, we're talking about Turkey, and this is actually a particularly odd one given the level of success that they enjoyed up to their departure. Turkey had finished in the top 10 5 of the previous 6 years before it withdrew from the show, and they had won it not long before that in 2003. Sadly, the contributing factors to the withdrawal were not something that could have been fixed by good results. The reasons cited by the broadcaster at the time in the statement that they made was the introduction of the 50-50 split vote between juries and the public, as well as the situation around the Big Five, that's Italy, France, Spain, Germany, and the UK. Turkey was displeased that they were allowed to automatically qualify for the final each year. Sadly, since then, things have got worse, not better, with the director of the broadcaster saying in 2018, "We aren't considering rejoining the contest. We have reasons like the voting system. As a public broadcaster, we also cannot broadcast live at 9 p.m. when children are still awake. Something like the bearded Austrian who wore a skirt does not believe in genders, and says that he is both a man and a woman. The EBU entered into discussions in 2022 with the broadcaster as well and got absolutely nowhere. To be honest, I'm kind of split on this one because while I really love Turkish music and they bring something really rich and authentic and unique to the contest, I'm not particularly willing to bend over backwards and make accommodations for a broadcaster that has expressed sentiments like the ones I just referenced. In any case, whether it does happen or not, the EBU is going to keep trying. The audience in Turkey is massive and the commercial interest is absolutely there. Therefore, I suspect there will be further rounds of discussions in future. Whether they'll get anywhere is anyone's guess. We're going to take two countries together now, and that is Romania and Bulgaria. The reason I'm talking about these together is because they actually have very similar stories. Both were powerhouses for a brief period at one time or another, have fallen out of love with the contest in the last few years, and both could realistically return in the near future. It's a bit strange given how recent Bulgaria's strongest finishes were that they're now not in the contest at all. But the thing is that even in that era, they suffered from the same problem that Romania does. That is low interest from the domestic audience. They're not the only ones in this video either. I talked about Slovakia before, and that was a problem for them too. To be honest, it plagues a lot of the broadcasters in Eastern Europe, especially in the Balkans. In the case of Romania, the winner of their national final in 2023 got just 5,000 votes. The broadcaster then followed that up by spending absolutely nothing on the entry and getting 0 points. In addition to that, they traumatized poor Teodor Andrei, who has since talked about his experience. I won't go into the details here, but essentially they were absolutely awful to him. After this, they dipped out of the contest altogether, and while they were given extra time to make a decision in 2024, their executive board ended up deciding not to fund the participation again. Bulgaria's exit was equally timid. They last made a serious effort in 2021 before phoning it in 2022 with a band that couldn't enter Spain for its pre-parties. This is because the singer would be arrested if he travelled to the country. It's kind of hard to predict what is going to happen for these two nations in the future because their interest fluctuates so wildly. So I'm going to sit on the fence and hedge my bets. I think we will see both of these countries back in the next 3 to 5 years, but it's going to be patchy. It'll be 1 year on, 1 year off, basically based on what the feeling of the executive board of each of the broadcasters is at the time. We may also see some self-funded projects like the one in 2022 for Bulgaria. It may have gone terribly, but the band paid for everything themselves. Therefore, there was no risk to the broadcaster. These kinds of things don't work and they build no momentum, so they will keep doing terribly. That will in turn cause them to withdraw, and then we go round the cycle again. I'd love to be wrong about this, but I just don't see the impetus for an ambitious continued project over several years in either of those two countries at the moment. We're going to end on a hopeful note, and that's with North Macedonia. Out of all of the countries in this video, this is probably the one that is the most likely to come back in the near future. They last participated in 2022 and came a lot closer to qualifying than many people expected. Then, much like many other countries in this video, they withdrew due to financial constraints. The difference here is that there was a clear intention to return. North Macedonia has continued to broadcast the contest in the last 2 years, even though they didn't send an entry. As well as that, they did include in the broadcaster's budget money set aside for Eurovision in 2024, and as a result, many of us thought this was going to be the year that they would come back. Unfortunately, this didn't quite materialize. The broadcaster issued a statement saying, "Such a decision is in the best interest of the citizens, taking into account that next year, the public service will focus with all its capacities on celebrating the Great Jubilee, 80 years of Macedonian radio and 60 years of Macedonian television. The activities to mark the Great Jubilee will take place throughout the year 2024. So, in short, they decided to fund a big party instead. Once again, though, like I said, they still broadcast the contest. Given the suggestion in this statement that the reasons for the non-participation were specific to 2024, there was a lot of hope that they would return in 2025. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's not looking likely because while a small amount of money has been allocated, it's nowhere near enough to fund a full participation. The likely route at the moment is that they will once again broadcast the show but not send an entry. Only time will tell if we're proven wrong, but because North Macedonia has stayed in the orbit of the contest and continues to broadcast it, a return in the future looks very likely. With that, we've reached the end of the video, and while there are some signs of hope in some places, the days of 42 or 43 participants in the contest are over and they're not coming back. That said, 40 is absolutely possible, and with any luck, we will see that soon in the next few years. Thank you again for watching, and thank you so much for the incredible reception to the video last week. Your support has totally blown me away, and I'm really grateful to everyone that has liked, commented, watched, subscribed on the back of that video. If you haven't done that yet, make sure to go watch it and make sure to subscribe to the channel too. For now, that's your lot for this week, and I will see you again in 7 days' time.